last panel, and this will touch on the difficulties, and this was one of the questions asked, of conducting espionage in a transparent, connected world. What are the trade-offs, what are the benefits, what are the opportunities, and how do we do it? Moderating this is Ambassador Ruben Brigety, who's Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at GW. The panel includes Alexander Joel, who's the Chief of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency at the Director of National Intelligence, Benjamin Huebner, who is the Privacy and Civil Liberties Officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, and Liza Goitein, who is the Co-Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ambassador Ruben Brigety. I'm the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at the George Washington University. And we are delighted to have you for this last panel of the day, entitled Masking Unmasked, Conducting Espionage in a Transparent, Connected World. We have taken this time to explore the very challenging and frankly perpetual issue of how one balances the issue of transparency that is incumbent on a democratic society with also the secrecy that is necessary in the conduct of espionage, and in particular to talk about the safeguards that the intelligence community employs to protect information, privacy, and civil liberties in what is an increasingly open and interconnected world. And also throughout the course of our discussion this afternoon, we hope to discuss as well the sharing of intelligence information and how such protections apply, in particular in the context of FISA Section 702, whose authorization Congress is expected to discuss and debate this fall. And we have a stellar panel of experts to help us do that today. To my immediate left is Mr. Alex Joel, who is the Chief of the Civil Liberties and Privacy Officer at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Next to Alex is Benjamin Huebner, who is the head of the Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties at the CIA. And finally, we have Elizabeth Goitein, who is the co-director of the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security Program. So panelists, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let me begin, Alex, with you, if I may. One could, just as we're having this conversation today about the balance between secrecy and transparency, this debate has been going on as long as the United States has had an intelligence function, and it's one that arguably is inherent in a free society that also has the need to conduct espionage as a component of its national security. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, does this need or this desire to balance secrecy on the one hand and transparency at the other put the United States at a comparative disadvantage in the practice of espionage against its adversaries? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Thanks, Ruben. I think in answer to directly answering your question, I think it actually is an advantage, but it has to be done properly and responsibly. I think what most harms the intelligence community is what I would think of as unplanned transparency, when there is an unauthorized disclosure of information, and a lot of information goes out the door without appropriate reviews and controls, and that can really be extremely damaging to national security. I want to very much distinguish an unauthorized disclosure from the kinds of transparency efforts we're implementing across the intelligence community, where we very thoughtfully and carefully review the information to make sure that what we're making available responds to a matter of public interest and has been carefully reviewed, redacted, vetted for information that could compromise sources and methods. When we talk about transparency within our own workforce, we sometimes hear questions and concerns regarding whether or not we are putting intelligence personnel in a difficult position where we are telling them both that we want to guard against unauthorized disclosures, but at the same time promote responsible transparency. And our response is that it's the individual intelligence professional's duty to protect intelligence sources and methods and to handle classified information properly and carefully. And it is our institutional obligation to respond to the kinds of democratic accountability requirements you were referring to. It is our institutional obligation to find responsible ways to provide more information to the public so they can better understand who we are, what we do, what our authorities are, and how we are implementing those authorities. And that can be very challenging. There's a lot of reasons why it's challenging, and it takes a painstaking process. As you pointed out, it's really been with the intelligence community for as long as we've been in existence. We have to protect secrecy in order to be effective. We can't obtain the secrets of adversaries if they understand exactly how we're going about doing so. We can't put our sources at risk. We have an obligation to our sources as well. And in order to continue to be effective, we have to maintain the secrecy of our sources and methods. But at the same time, in order to earn and retain public trust, they have to have greater confidence that they understand what it is we're doing and that we're acting in a manner that's consistent with our expectations and values. So that can be a very difficult balance to maintain. One of the things that we have been doing, for example, is speaking to Eliza and her colleagues in the advocacy community about how we conduct our authorities and trying to respond to the issues and questions that they raised the best we can. It is a slow process. There is no magic bullet answer that I think will cut through the line-by-line review that's needed in order to figure out what information can be put out properly. And I'll just add one additional note, which is when you're doing transparency with this degree of care, you have to pull on limited resources. The people who are most expert at determining whether release of information might damage national security are the people who are doing the work itself, who are actually the analysts, the program managers, the folks on the front line actually carrying out and using that intelligence authority. They're the ones in the best position to determine whether or not releasing information about what they're doing could harm national security. And so when we pull them in, and as we do and as we must, into our transparency-related work, we're pulling them away from their operational activities. So that is another thing that we have to carefully balance. I think that if we don't have the trust of the public, of the American people, and give our foreign partners confidence that we can explain our activities in ways that they have to justify for the legitimacy of their own activities in their countries, if we can't do that, we risk losing public trust, which in turn impacts our ability to conduct our activities. We can't have the authorities and the flexibility that we feel we need as an intelligence community to carry out our mission. I don't know if you guys have something to add.
Actually, if I can, before I get, because I think you've actually given us the quote of the day, which is unplanned transparency. I'm going to put that on a bumper sticker somewhere and use it. And I wonder if I can maybe use that, Elizabeth, to go to you, because as we've said, this is a debate that has been going back and forth since the creation of an intelligence community for the United States. And the reason I suspect it has continued is because the line keeps moving with regard to how much transparency versus how much secrecy, and I think certainly in the era of the Snowden disclosures or Chelsea Manning or whatnot, this question of unplanned transparency can be one of the things that can push the pendulum closer towards the issue of more secrecy. And I'm wondering from your perspective, both as you see the current debate regarding the reauthorization of Section 702, but also, frankly, the broader debates about how we should be conducting intelligence now. What are those pillars of the debate that policymakers, congresspeople, general public ought to be thinking about how to balance, where that pendulum should lie as we sit here today in 2017?
Okay, so Section 702 specifically is what you're wondering about. Okay. Most of the issues that are on the table about Section 702 actually, believe it or not, don't relate to transparency. There are some transparency questions about whether or not the intelligence community can provide more statistics about the activities that are conducted under Section 702. For example, there has been a big controversy over whether or not the intelligence community should be providing an estimate of the number of Americans who are swept up in Section 702 surveillance. And it's been years that this conversation has been dragging on. And so Congress may actually want to step in and put its thumb on the scale there. And there are other reporting issues as well, transparency that could enhance public trust, but also facilitate accountability when it comes to Section 702 surveillance. But I think some of the main issues around Section 702, which of course is the authority that allows the government to target foreigners overseas for surveillance without getting a warrant, even if they're communicating with Americans and even if their communications are stored inside the United States. This is an authority that's been used apparently very effectively as a counterterrorism tool to monitor suspected terrorists overseas and to disrupt their plots. And I think there's actually no serious effort afoot to disturb the core functionality of Section 702, which is, again, to be able to conduct warrantless surveillance of known or suspected foreign threats. But there is a lot of concern, and not just among civil liberties advocates, but among lawmakers, about the impact of Section 702 on Americans, and more specifically, the scope of incidental surveillance of Americans' communications, and whether the back-end protections for that incidentally collected information of Americans are sufficient. And I think that's where you're likely to see Congress take action on this front-end issue of the scope of incidental collection. The permissible pool of targets under Section 702 is extremely broad. It's essentially any foreigner overseas, as long as there's a foreign intelligence purpose. And foreign intelligence is itself defined quite broadly. So at least on paper, this law could allow the targeting of an ordinary private citizen overseas who's not suspected of any connection to terrorism and who has no connection with a foreign power. I don't know if that's how the law is actually being used. I certainly hope it isn't. But it's allowed under the statute. And the problem with that is not just the privacy rights of foreigners. They do have privacy rights under treaties that the United States has signed. But the impact on Americans, because the wider the pool of foreign targets, the wider the pool of Americans who will be incidentally surveilled. And the greater the likelihood that those will just be innocent conversations between Americans and their friends and their relatives and people they do business with overseas. So there's a question that's being asked about whether or not the scope of surveillance could be narrowed to people suspected of connections to foreign powers, people suspected of having information about security threats, consistent with the national security benefits of the statute. And then the biggest issue, I'll try to be brief, is what's referred to as backdoor searches. That's the practice that when agencies obtain the raw data that's collected under Section 702, their procedures allow them to sort through that information looking for the communications of particular Americans that they're interested in. And from a civil liberties perspective, that's problematic because if the government wants to read an American's emails or phone calls, they usually have to go to the court and get a warrant. And in order to avoid getting a warrant under Section 702, they have to certify, the government has to certify to the FISA court that it's not interested in any particular known Americans, that its interest is in the foreign target. And yet immediately after getting the data, they can go looking for particular known Americans after having just said, nope, we've got no designs on them. So this, I've said it many times, but I'll say it again, it's a bait and switch. That is in real tension with the spirit, if not the letter, of Section 02's restrictions on targeting Americans. So I think we are very likely to see some action on that in Congress.
So thank you for that, Elizabeth. So Benjamin, as the head of Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties at the CIA, you are arguably at the epicenter, at the fulcrum of this balance. And I wonder if we might ask you to give your strictly non-political professional judgment of what is at stake as Congress tries to debate the reauthorization of 702 on the issues that Elizabeth just mentioned. So on the one hand, if, for example, it is reauthorized, but in a way that more narrowly constricts the ability of the IC to collect information as a means of trying to protect Americans better, what are the implications from an election side? And conversely, what are the implications if, from a privacy side, if Congress decides the intelligence community needs a more broad mandate to be able to make these sorts of collections?
Sure. So Section 702, as Elizabeth said earlier, is a part of FISA that allows the targeting of non-U.S. persons located outside the United States. to collect specific categories of foreign intelligence information. It's a large program, but it should probably be put in context. So NSA has released that last year, in 2016, there were 106,000 targets of 702 collection, all non-US persons outside the United States, but 106,000. That's a substantial program. There are also a lot more than 106,000 people, or internet users. There are 7.5 billion people. There were last year approximately 250,000 people, scientists say, who were struck by lightning. So one good way of thinking about what's the impact on US persons, or to an average US person, is to think of the number of emails that you in 2016 sent to or from a person who was outside the United States and a non-US person, and who was also struck by lightning last year. Take that number in your head and divide it by 2.5. That's what we're talking about. Now, does that mean it never happens? No, of course it does. And Congress knew that, and they required there to be specific procedures regarding that targeting, specific procedures regarding the retention of any U.S. person information on dissemination, and specific procedures going to the querying of information about when that can be queried for a foreign intelligence purpose. So there is going to be an active debate. There should be an active debate. One of the things about this program, though, is, as Elizabeth said, there is widespread agreement that is enormously effective. And so if you look back to 2014, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board did a very comprehensive review of this program. And for those who know the members of that board, it was a unanimous report, and if you have Rachel Brand and Judge Wald agreeing on something, you know you have the widest of spectrums, that there were proper protections. Now, those protections include the dissemination of information. And in terms of querying, they do require a proper foreign intelligence purpose. They require that there be auditing of those foreign intelligence purposes. And to date, in all of those auditings, for all of the reviews done by offices such as ours, offices by the Department of Justice, internal, Congress, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, there have been exactly 0 incidents of intentional misuse of the authority, both in queries or otherwise. So that's not to say there isn't a privacy impact, but it is to say that we certainly don't have a problem of abuse. Specifically going to queries, what would be that impact? I think is part of your question. If there was a restriction to, say, probable cause to do a US person query. So, for example, and these examples are incredibly difficult to declassify, but we've been able to do one. CIA had 702 collection on a foreign procurement network. And based on that collection on the targeting of a non-US person, they saw that there were about a little less than $200,000 worth of goods that were about to imminently leave the United States and be shipped to a country of concern for the United States. So that's what we knew. What we didn't know is whether that US manufacturer was part of this foreign procurement network, whether they were being duped by this network, some gray area in between. If there had been a probable cause standard, we wouldn't have met it, that they were an agent of a foreign power. What they were able to do under this authority was they were able to query using identifiers associated with that manufacturer, that 702 collection, and able to look through the collection, and they were ultimately able to determine that the manufacturer was not involved. They were unwitting of this, where these goods were ultimately going to go. That allowed them, in this pretty imminent situation, to go reach out to US law enforcement, stop that shipment. And that did 2 things. One, it protected our national security to prevent those goods from going to that country of concern. And 2, it protected the company. We probably would not have been able to approach them if we thought that there was a chance or even a likelihood that they were part of this activity. And the knowledge that they weren't was what allowed us to proceed.
Thank you. Before I come back to Alex to ask a broader question about the individual professional responsibilities of intelligence officers, I'd like to give Elizabeth the floor, because I was reading your facial expressions as Benjamin was giving the example of being struck by lightning as a way of trying to understand the impact on our civil liberties. And I was wondering if you had a repost.
Maybe 106,000 targets. Targets aren't just individuals. Correct? Targets are persons who are defined as organizations or people. We don't know how many people it is. We do know that in 2011, that was 250 million internet communications that were obtained under Section 702. The number of Americans whose communications fell in that 250 million, even by the most conservative estimate you can imagine, it's still going to be, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Americans' communications that are getting picked up every year and then kept for 5 years. So this is having an impact without a doubt. And when it comes to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board's report, in fact, Rachel Brand and Judge Wald agreed that Section 702 came close to the line of constitutional reasonableness. That's what they said. So they said it was a pretty close call whether it was constitutional or not. I think we can do better than that, than treading that close to the line on Americans' constitutional rights. And also, Judge Wald, along with David Medine, the chair of the PCLOB, dissented on whether the protections that were in place on backdoor searches were sufficient. They actually recommended stronger protections. So it's not quite as simple as Ben made it seem. And yeah, the fact is, when you need a warrant to look at an American's communications, there are going to be cases in which you don't have probable cause and you won't see them. That's what the Fourth Amendment means.
Thank you.
Can I just jump
Please,
on
sure.
this for a second? So I think what this discussion illustrates is, and I'll go back to the transparency theme here, is how much progress has been made in terms of transparency, because Liza and Ben are able now to talk publicly about certain details that previously, just a few years ago, we would not be in a position to discuss. We have released large volumes of information, and if for those of you who don't know where to find the information, it's on IC, it's on the record, it's a Tumblr site, it's called IC on the Record, just Google it and you'll find it pretty quickly. And we have been posting on that site not only information that we are proactively reviewing and disclosing, but also information that's been disclosed pursuant to Freedom of Information Act requests. And even when we get a Freedom of Information Act request, our posture has been to sort of lean forward and see what we can discretionarily release that relates to that topic. One of the problems I think you'll see if you do go to IC on the Record is that it can be very complicated to sort through what's on there and what it means. And we have been dealing with this challenge for quite a while, and I don't know that we have the answer to it. So if anyone has brilliant ideas, I'd certainly be open to them. But on the one hand, we have to release the underlying legal document so that people can see for themselves what it is we're doing. On the other hand, we also have to release some kind of a statement to better explain and put into context that document. And the statement is one that we are working to try to make it more readily understandable to the average person who might be interested in this subject. But at the same time, we can't release an inaccurate statement. So in some cases, we're pushed to try to mirror the technical legal language that was the cause of the confusion to begin with for people who haven't been part of this conversation for the last few years. We have released also, we put together something which I have been promoting at every opportunity, as you guys know, called the Guide to Posted Documents. I know it's a very clever title. It's our attempt to sort of take key documents about these kinds of authorities that you've heard discussed here and put in links, put them under categories so that you can more easily find it. And if you go to the left side of IC on the Record, which I'm sure you all are busily doing right now, you'll see a link to that particular document. The statistics that are being talked about are important. I just want to highlight another thing that we have put together. For 2 years, we put together the annual Statistical Transparency Report, where we try to gather certain key statistics and present them, including the kinds of numbers that have been discussed here. And then the USA Freedom Act was enacted, Congress passed a law, and one of the things it did was codify that annual transparency report. So there are actually been and we've published 2 years of transparency reports since then. If you look at the latest transparency report, we tried to better explain what it was that we were releasing statistics about. And when I recently reread that report, I thought, my goodness, we have a long way to go to make this more easy to understand. But nonetheless, if you go on that Guide to Posted Documents, you can see the annual transparency report, and you can find some of these key statistics for yourself.
Alice, before we go to the floor for questions, let me ask you one more, if I may. So the title of this conference is the Ethos and Profession of Intelligence. And when I think of ethos and profession, I think about what members of that community should do beyond that which they are simply legally required to do. And I'm wondering, from your long experience in the intelligence community, how should an individual analyst, an individual collector somewhere around the world be thinking about how she or he ought to be trying to balance transparency and secrecy in the conduct of her or his business, beyond that which may be legally required?
So, yes, and that is the title of the conference. It is something that we have on our minds quite a bit. Obviously, we have to abide by the law, but it goes beyond that. Like, what is the ethos of an intelligence professionals? And interestingly enough, we did tackle that a few years ago. We do have a set of principles of professional ethics for the intelligence professional. We have them on these handy, we call these badge buddies, so that you can carry them around with you.
Are those secret, or can other people get them?
They are classified. No, they're not classified. Yes, you can get them. I didn't bring enough copies to hand out for the audience.
That's really small.
I know. So to illustrate the font size, so it's mission, truth, lawfulness, integrity, stewardship, excellence, and diversity. And for example, for mission, it's we serve the American people and understand that our mission requires selfless dedication to the security of our nation. Truth is we seek the truth, speak truth to power, and obtain, analyze, and provide intelligence objectively, etc. So lawfulness, of course, talks about our duty to support and defend the Constitution, which is another thing that I'll just mention as part of who it is to be an intelligence professional. We all take oaths when we start our work, and in fact, some agencies renew that oath on a yearly basis. We did so at ODNI on Constitution Day. We all renewed our oath to support and defend the Constitution. So it's really what we're trying to celebrate among the intelligence community is what's already there, which is a commitment to perform our duties in a way that reflects the values of the nation. The way I think of the transparency work as well or one way to think about it, is that we are providing information as part of our oath to support and defend the Constitution, as part of the functioning of our democracy, to make sure that we have public accountability and that the American people understand what it is that we're doing and can either support it or not support it. We can have a discussion like we're having right here about FISA Section 702.
Yeah, I can't undersell how important that oath is. And the first day you are a CI officer, you go to our memorial wall, and before those stars, you swear that oath. And it's not to the agency, and it's not to the executive, and it's not to the president, and it's not to the director. It is to the Constitution. And I have had many, many officers tell me that first day and that first moment of their day, it was the point at which they felt truly like a CIA officer. Step back for a second. That is fundamentally different than intelligence officers in many other countries. To say that we are going to define how we practice intelligence within this constitutional framework, and a constitutional framework that, when I speak internally, I remind folks, is a set of laws, but also a set of normative behavior. There are free speech norms that extend beyond what the First Amendment requires, that if you are not aware of, you will get yourself into trouble. It is absolutely part of every aspect of what we do, and it makes us somewhat different than certainly our adversaries, and sometimes even from our allies. But none of us would trade it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So I will, if I could just add to that, and I don't know, Liza, if you had something, but part of your question, so that's sort of the general high-level principled situation. What part of your question sort of gets at, okay, you have your statutes and your laws and your executive orders, the legal requirements. Are there also requirements that the agencies impose on themselves to address different kinds of concerns and considerations? And the answer to that is yes. There are internal policies, procedures that each agency puts in place, that we also put in place at the intelligence community level with intelligence community directives to try to govern the activities of agencies, even in situations where the law might allow us greater flexibility and discretion. We're going to put in place a set of procedures that are more detailed and specific. Part of the reason for that is to make sure we don't get too close to the line that Liza was talking about, so that we have in place a more careful approach to doing things than maybe a creative lawyer might interpret and apply for an intelligence agency. But there are issues that come up with that, and different kinds of reviews have been done where people worry that we have too many rules, that the rules are too different across intelligence agencies, and that once you put in place a rule, it's difficult to update it with changes in technology. And we did experience that with Executive Order 12333. That's the executive order that governs, that sort of lays out the framework for conducting intelligence. Obviously, it says we follow the Constitution and the statutes of the United States. But in addition, it establishes a set of requirements, for example, to protect information about Americans and lawful permanent residents and U.S. companies and U.S. associations. And so each agency has to have procedures under that executive order and that detail how it's going to do that. And those procedures differ by agency. Each agency has a different mission, a different operating environment, and they have different procedures. And I know, Ben, you recently went through that with CIA's procedures in terms of updating them. They hadn't been updated in, I don't remember how long.
They hadn't been substantively updated since the 1980s, and we changed them for two primary reasons. One, if you were getting a sheet of paper, they were great procedures. They told you exactly what to do. When you were talking about the digital environment, they were not terribly helpful. When you would have more U.S. person information in sort of that digital environment. But the second, and kind of tying it back to the first questions that we did, it was for transparency. Those guidelines are posted on CIA's website in their entirety, no redactions. That was very difficult to do, and what we had to do is we had to effectively blow them up and rewrite them to get to that point of transparency, but we thought it was critical that if we were talking about, you can't always talk about the methods that we collect information, but what we can talk about are the protections we give U.S. persons as we handle that information. And that was critical for us to do, and we're proud that we did it.
Before we go to the floor, Elizabeth, I wonder if I might ask you the same question but in reverse. So as a civil society advocate that follows these issues, what is it that you expect as a citizen of our intelligence community, our intelligence professionals, beyond that which the law requires? I think, for example, in your last comment, you just said that we can do better than simply coming close to the standard of constitutional reasonableness. I'm wondering if you have a general response to
Right. Well, I think the intelligence community needs to recognize that while it does have, people like Alex and Ben, who I'm glad that they have the positions they have. I'm glad those positions exist. I'm glad these people fill them. That's important. But protecting civil liberties is always going to be a secondary consideration for intelligence agencies. It's never going to be the primary consideration. That's not their mission. That's not what they're focused on. For checks and balances to work, it is not enough for them to be entirely internal. Self-policing is not sufficient. Congress needs to be able to do its job, and the courts need to be able to do their job. And with the level of secrecy that exists right now, they can't. The question of what the Constitution requires, if anything, when it comes to Americans' communications that are collected under Executive Order 12333, that's a question for the courts to decide. Marbury versus Madison. That's the role of the courts to make that decision. The courts can't review Executive Order 12333 at all right now because of the secrecy, and the courts are still facing some challenges in reviewing Section 702. And when it comes to the procedures and the rules and the protections for Americans' information, these are policy decisions that have enormous impact on Americans. Americans should be the ones deciding what trade-offs they're willing to accept, what the policies should look like. That's what a democracy is. And so for Americans to do that, they have to be able to have the information, and they have to be able to write letters, nobody writes letters, to write emails to their representatives in Congress and to become involved through the democratic process. And the democratic process doesn't work well if there's not enough information out there. So I think the intelligence community needs to understand. I applaud the greater transparency that we've seen from the intelligence community in the last few years. I think it's extremely positive. I think there are many positive features of the oversight structures that are put in place. They're not enough. We need checks and balances, and we need the American people to govern themselves as they do in a democracy. And for that, I think we need even greater transparency.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the floor for questions. We have a little more than 10 minutes. I have a little bit of hard time seeing, but I think there's a gentleman here in the front. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm retired from the U.S. Army. I think there's a difference between to have crystal clear information about intelligence to the community and to the regular citizen. You can never have full, complete, crystal clear information that you might be collecting from XY country to the regular citizen. What's occurring right now in North Korea with the nuclear, it is a crisis. Many of the citizens don't know what really is happening. The U.S. government and the intelligence, they know what's going on. But many times you cannot divulge all the information to the community.
I think that may have been directed at me. If you don't mind, I'll just say, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a tension between the need to keep operational details secret and the need for Americans to have the information they need to engage in self-government. There is a tension there. We have to understand what that tension means. Anytime information is classified and withheld, properly classified and withheld from the public, the democratic process works a little less well. And so it's critical that it be kept to a bare minimum. And I think that's where, and reasonable people can absolutely disagree on what the bare minimum looks like. It's not a science by any means. But I think it's hard to argue that we're there, that we're at the bare minimum. I mean, I wrote a couple of reports having to do with classification and various kinds of government secrecy. For those reports, I spoke with dozens of former and current intelligence officials. Every single one of them told me that too much information is classified. So I can't tell you, and classified unnecessarily, and I can't tell you exactly where the line can be, where the line should be, but I can tell you what direction the line needs to be pushed right now.
So can I also jump in? So I think where to draw the line is the key question, and it's very difficult to figure that out. We have come a long way in terms of how much information we've disclosed. The safe course would be to not, from a classification perspective, is not to reveal any information about broad topics. So the risk, let's say you have a really important source that you're trying to protect, and if you draw the circle around that source in terms of like the information that you're blacking out from inquiry, you're well protected because people aren't going to be able to infer what that core secret is. The more information you release around that core secret, the better the adversaries will be at inferring what it is that you're withholding. So that's been sort of the ethos of intelligence professionals, is like, I have to be very quiet about this entire area. So there's no question that even planned transparency carries risks. And so the more we release information, the better able a sophisticated adversary may be to infer what it is that's being redacted in that document. That is a risk that I think is necessary, that we have to assume and manage carefully and work our way through, because we are in a democracy and the people do need to be informed. I certainly agree with Liza that we have to have an informed discussion about these authorities. And the question of where to draw the line is very difficult. Like I said, I don't have the magic answer other than good old-fashioned, consultation, judgment, careful work, and handling it in a step-by-step responsible manner.
Benjamin, did you want to comment?
So I'm going to agree with much of what Liza said. There is too much classification. And I think one of the reasons for that, and it's important to understand what the reasons are as you try to tackle it, is that the risks are often very tangible.
Sorry, very what?
Very tangible.
Yeah.
While the benefits are a little less so. And particularly that's difficult for the intelligence community insofar as open source information is very important for when we do our analysis of other countries. Our professionals know how useful the information that governments release can be in doing intelligence analysis, and so it scares them when our own government does the same. Does that mean we don't have to get this right? Absolutely not. And I think there are two parts to getting it right. One part is some of the work that Alex has really been leading in terms of that planned transparency on these big issues. But the second part of that is the day-in, day-out classification decisions that are made. And the way you tackle that and where we put a lot of our resources is training. From the very first days and then periodically throughout, we've thrown a lot more resources on training folks on proper classification, very much with an eye to concerns over overclassification. And that overclassification can be problematic for the public, That overclassification can be problematic for the intelligence community itself, right? To the degree that we overclassify information, it sometimes prevents us from sharing information that we should share. And so getting that right, there is an impetus and a benefit to the IC itself in doing that. It's a very difficult issue. It's one we need to do more on.
And I would add that I think overclassification can directly lead to unplanned transparency. And that's another reason to avoid it.
I'm going to regret using that term.
Great term. That's another reason to do it, to tackle the problem of overclassification, is because I think people lose faith in the system. They start to, they just don't respect the classification system when it seems so arbitrary and when things that clearly don't need to be classified are classified. And it's just, people take it upon themselves. And of course, there's a huge risk that the baby's going to get thrown out with the bathwater when people deputize themselves to decide what they're going to make public. So I think there are many, many advantages to tackling the problem of overclassification. I will say that there have been congressional committees and blue ribbon commissions that have looked at this problem for decades, basically since the modern classification system began. And every time one of these committees looks at the problem, they say, wow, there's still massive overclassification. It's been a problem throughout. It is a very intractable problem. And so I don't think it can be solved through training, because if it could, it would have been solved by now. I think there need to be bigger picture, more creative solutions. Maybe this is where I refer you all to my report, Reducing Overclassification Through Accountability. One of the issues is the lack of accountability for overclassification, but I won't go into detail.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. I applaud everybody in the panel for a job well done in kind of defending each other's positions in a respectful manner. I know how hard it is. I was 18 years in the federal government, and I myself classified a lot of information and read a lot of stuff. And I can tell you that it's a very, very hard job to do. It's a hard call to make. I will say that although I don't envy any of you guys' jobs, I will say that individuals who have not been held accountable for the leaking of information or providing information that is classified to the general public has not helped the argument either way. And just like in the intelligence community, we look at them as individuals who have, betrayed kind of that oath that they took. And then the other side looks at it as, well, it's overclassification, or it was an issue of, they wanted to expose X, Y, and Z. I think it hurts the argument. It hurts because at that same glimpse of time, every intelligence officer is going to start classifying information and putting other classification markings just to protect from the shockwave of the information that has now just hit the open internet. And so my question to the panel is, how do you tackle the stuff that's already out without putting your hands in front of an issue that our adversary is definitely not putting their hands over their eyes?
So I guess I have a couple reactions. One is I do think we take the issue of unauthorized disclosures seriously. I know that there are sometimes frustrations when there's news about a leak and it doesn't seem like anyone is getting arrested or punished, or there isn't a conviction. There have been a string of recent criminal prosecutions relating to unauthorized disclosure. There are certainly complaints from civil society and others that we are going too far in the other direction and going after insider threats and leakers. So I think there's more of a nuanced picture around that, and I do think that is certainly, in my experience, something that we take extremely seriously and refer for criminal prosecution as appropriate. Once information gets out that has been leaked, I think you would recognize very well we are in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, it's being publicly discussed. On the other hand, we can't really come in and engage in that discussion in any kind of direct way, because that would confirm the legitimacy and validity of the information, which, because it's still legitimately classified, we are not able to confirm or deny it. That said, once the public is discussing a particular topic, whether it be prompted by inaccurate reporting from a leak or whatever, we do take that into consideration in terms of what's in the public interest for us to try to proactively go through our processes and release it through proper channels. Did you have?
Elizabeth, do you have this view on the prosecution of unauthorized disclosures? I think you made the point that a lot of people will say they're going to take it upon themselves to release this information, and one could argue in some ways that it's an act of civil sort of conscience to be able to do that, but on the other hand, there's obviously an argument that clearly it harms national security. But what harm is there if the information should be classified in the first place?
I don't like the fact that I don't like unauthorized disclosures of classified information. I think that is not a good way to handle the issue of classified information that shouldn't be classified or that includes evidence of wrongdoing by the government. The question is it better to have that than to have a situation where the government can act illegally and against the Constitution and the American people never know about it? I would much prefer a third option, which is that the law provides adequate protection for whistleblowers within the intelligence community, which I believe it doesn't right now. And I think if there were adequate protections for whistleblowers who are genuinely revealing information that they have a reasonable belief is evidence of government misconduct of some kind, waste, fraud, or abuse, if those protections were in place, it would be a lot easier, I think. I think the whole system would work much better, and it would be a lot easier to draw that line between disclosures that can be prosecuted, that should be prosecuted, and disclosures that should actually be protected. Now, I think there's a whole other category, which is authorized, unauthorized disclosures or sort of official leaks where administration officials are themselves leaking information to journalists classified information, in order to put the government's, the executive branches, the administration's spin on issues. And I think that this kind of selective leaking and selective non-enforcement of anti-leaking laws is very, very damaging to the system, and it underscores the issue of overclassification. Because if high-level officials can safely, in their own minds, and they're trying to further the interests of the government, of the administration, can safely leak that information, then clearly it should never have been classified in the first place. So that's a lot of different answers to one question. But.
Thank you. I hope you'll agree with me. This has been a fascinating panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in thanking our panelists for this great discussion.
Well, thank you, Dean Brigety, and thank you to the panel. We are at the final throes of an amazing day. And before I introduce our closing speaker, President Thomas LeBlanc, the 17th president of George Washington University, and he's only a couple months into the job, but he's started it and at a full sprint and getting things done, so really excited about that. But I do want to say thank you to the Office of Public Affairs at the Central Intelligence Agency. These guys just get it done. Dean Boyd, thank you. And two in particular that I would like to recognize, Janelle and Amber. They're as good as it gets, and I'm glad they're on the good guy's side, because if they were on the bad guy's side, we'd be in a lot of trouble. I'd also like to quickly recognize my own team, Christian, Lisa, our amazing interns, Melissa, Heather, and Helen, and Christina, who we were able to pull from previous events, and Ethan. And without further ado, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I want to introduce President LeBlanc, and thank you. So without further ado, Mr. President.
Thank you, Frank, and thank all of you for being here today. The George Washington University is honored to have co-hosted this event, now in its third year, on our campus. I would first like to thank the many participants who have lent their expertise to discussions today, including CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who joined today's conference earlier this morning, the four former CIA directors, John Brennan, Michael Hayden, Peter Goss, and William Webster, who spoke together in a discussion earlier this afternoon, and all of the distinguished experts and leaders on panels ranging from issues such as the security in East Asia and the global challenge of biothreats. As a comprehensive global research university in the heart of our nation's capital, I believe we can play two key roles in important conversations such as the one that brought us together today. First of all, we help convene. Working in partnership with the CIA, we help bring together the diverse array of intelligence community leaders and representatives from other government agencies, private industry, nonprofits, and the media who engage with us today. But just as important, we participate. This university is an indispensable resource for the federal government. Our staff at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security produces fantastic policy research and analysis on homeland security, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity issues. Our faculty members in international affairs, public policy, law, security policy, computer science, and many other disciplines are the best in their fields, bringing varied backgrounds and perspectives to solve tough problems. And of course, we at GW are helping to shape the country's, and indeed the world's, next generation of leaders. Through master's degrees and other professional degree programs, we are also helping many current leaders enhance and expand their skills. As with any of our nation's most critical issues, they are best tackled when bringing together the greatest minds and their different opinions. We are honored to have collaborated with the CIA today to do this. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day.